Welcome, everyone. I am so glad you're here for part 2 of the Growth Readiness Series, also part 2 of my personal exposure therapy to practice public speaking and to practice my take on these concepts in all of you. So thank you in advance. In part 1, we talked about alignment as the operating glue between leadership, teams, and strategy. And we explored the 4 pillars of growth readiness that help diagnose where breakdowns happen. And we closed with this reminder: you can't scale what you can't see. That's why we looked at feedback loops, listening gaps, and how misalignment often hides in decision-making, not just in communication. And so today we are going underneath that foundation because alignment won't hold if culture and capability are weak. Culture and capability, they are other invisible forces like alignment that either fuel your growth or kill it. And they are 2 concepts that are often misunderstood. They can be shrugged off as soft skills, but I want to make it the case today that these are not side topics. This is not a side dish. They are the system. They determine whether your strategy actually moves or gets stuck, whether your people grow or they burn out, or whether your business scales or starts silently and internally imploding. And just a personal anecdote about why this matters to me. I think culture, to me, isn't just what it feels like to work inside your business. It's also how your business impacts the humans inside it. And capability is your organization's strength and steadiness. So its ability to follow through without constant heroics. When these 2 things are strong, people thrive. And when they're broken, people suffer. And I don't use that word lightly. That ripple effect extends far beyond the workplace. It touches families and communities and mental health and how people show up in the rest of their lives. So yes, we'll look at the strategy implications today. We'll talk systems, structures, and execution, but underneath it all is something deeper. How we lead creates the conditions that people live and work inside. And we all have a role in making those conditions better. So keep that lens in mind and let's dive in. In terms of both of these words, culture clearly has the bigger reputation problem. I've really seen it being branded as something fluffy and also something that's sort of optional. For years, companies have talked about culture in terms of how much fun the office is. And to be fair, fun perks and optics, they aren't meaningless. Done well, they can signal something deeper. Like a flexible schedule can reflect trust, or a team retreat can build shared memory. And even swag, when used intentionally, can reinforce identity. And the problem is not with the perks, it's when companies stop there. It's when people confuse those surface level signals for real culture. And real culture, that means the habits, systems, and shared behaviors that hold up under pressure. I would argue that everyone in the workplace intuitively already knows this at some level. And culture doesn't fail because you don't have the right slogan or brand or retreat. It fails when there is a gap between what you say and how you behave. So culture is the invisible operating system underneath everything you do: how decisions get made, how conflict is handled, and how priorities get communicated. And to me, again, this isn't just a business issue, it's a human one, because the way your culture feels affects how people sleep at night, how they move through the world. And when we get it right, productivity will definitely improve, and you'll also improve people's lives too. When culture efforts feel shallow or performative, it's usually, in my experience, because the leaders inside the business are too far removed from the humans who are actually running the day-to-day. And I've seen this firsthand. Earlier in my career, I worked on employee engagement surveys. I've probably mentioned this before. And in my experience, the results from the front lines would be clear. They would say leadership is out of touch. They don't get what it's like down here. They don't get what it's like to be us. And the wild part is that that feedback never made it to the top. It got filtered, softened, buried, because managers don't want to take the heat or they don't know what to do with it. And so leadership can become completely unaware, operating in leadership la la land, making decisions without ever hearing the full story. And that's how culture gets shallow, when there's no direct connection between power and reality. And when leadership starts managing from a distance, culture turns into performance. And that's when perks get tossed out like treats. And employees start to feel like they're being pacified instead of empowered. So don't build a culture like you are tossing meat to lions, because people just don't like to be treated like zoo animals. And Peter Drucker said it decades ago, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And here are the receipts. Organizations with strong execution capability are 3 times more likely to outperform competitors. So translation, you don't need a good idea. You need the internal strength to deliver on it. And capability, which we'll talk about later, is your multiplier. In terms of financial performance, disengaged employees cost US companies up to $550 billion per year. That's not a rounding error. That's what happens when people disconnect because they don't trust you and they don't feel heard and they stop trying. Companies with toxic cultures also see up to 35% lower productivity and performance. That's a full third of your potential output gone. Not because your team doesn't have the talent, but because the environment is working against them. And 70% of business transformations fail, not because the strategy was wrong, but because leadership wasn't aligned and the culture inside the company can't support the change. And that's what always gets me, because strategy gets all the attention, but culture and alignment, which we talked about last time, determine whether it sticks. And then on the flip side, employees who feel connected to their culture are 4 times more likely to be engaged, which tells us that culture is not a nice to have. It's the difference between people showing up and people phoning it in. And yet, despite everything we know, despite the research, the case studies, the human stories, we're still seeing companies make the same mistakes. We're still seeing the news every day of companies rolling out rigid return to office mandates with little conversation, leaders making broad cultural decisions in isolation, and policies that feel less like guidance and more like control wrapped in professional language, but always rooted in mistrust. And I don't think that's malicious, again, to what we just discussed in the last slide. Sometimes it's just distance, it's fear, it's scarcity, but the effect's the same. Employees feel managed, not respected. They feel directed. They don't feel heard. And when the labor market tilts in favor of employers, as it has in recent months, many leaders start to assume that they can afford to stop listening, that trust can be paused and proximity to the workforce is optional. But labor cycles always change and culture has a long memory. So those decisions made in moments of power imbalance, those quick calls, the conversations that get ignored, they don't disappear when the pendulum swings the other way. They compound. And often the first signal is not data, it's the people. And ironically, the ones that you want to keep. So let's talk about what happens when they start to leave. Oops. So culture doesn't usually collapse in a single moment. Sometimes it unravels slowly. And I read a post on LinkedIn recently, it was the other day, and I wish I could find it so I could give credit, but it was pointing out this order of operations that rang really true to me. First, your best people leave, not because of money, but because they can no longer believe they can make a difference. And then the next tier really is those high potential, high care individuals. They stick around longer because they try to fix things from the inside. They join the committees, they raise the concerns, and they keep showing up until they burn out too. I have watched a lot of brilliant people walk away, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much for too long without seeing change. And I've been there personally myself too. And eventually you're left with 2 groups, the disengaged and the hostages. And those are the people, so they're either quietly doing the bare minimum, or they're staying because they feel stuck, not because they trust where you're going. And by the time your metrics catch up, the damage is already done. So like in other presentations, we want to be able to spot those early warning signs before it reaches that point. We want to know the offhand comments, the quiet hesitations, the friction that tells you that something deeper is misaligned. So when culture starts to erode, that's when dysfunction settles in. But if you know what to look for, these warning signs will help you diagnose what's going on much more quickly. Besides your top performers leaving and those once engaged employees withdrawing their effort, these are a few other things you should also look out for. Teams that are sprinting in every direction, but usually no one actually knows where the finish line is. Everything feels urgent, but nothing feels meaningful. When people stop offering feedback, often this means that your team members have decided or learned that it's safer not to speak. And another example would be when ownership gets fuzzy, deadlines slide, and people are hesitating to act because no one's quite sure who's driving. And when people stop raising their hands, they might still show up, but the spark is gone. And finally, when your projects stall over small approvals, that's death by 1,000 quiet breakdowns. And when these cracks start forming, when silence and confusion become the norm, the instinct is often to ask, why is this happening? But maybe the better question is, who is shaping this? Who is responsible for this? Because culture doesn't just happen, it's built every day by what gets said, by what gets rewarded, and by what gets ignored. So let's talk about who's really defining the culture inside your organization, whether they know it or not. Culture is collective, but it's not democratic. So everyone contributes, but I would argue they do not contribute equally. Leaders set the ceiling and the floor. So what does that mean? It means leaders define the range of what is considered acceptable. So the ceiling is the highest standard of behavior that you're willing to model, and the floor is the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. So if a leader regularly communicates clearly, consistently, with curiosity, that's the ceiling. They're setting that tone. But if that same leader lets a high performer bully others without consequence, or is following stated values in public but not in private, that's the floor. So everyone else will adapt their behavior somewhere in between. The top always sets the tone, consciously or not. Even when they're silent, even when they're not involved, they're always broadcasting culture through what they emphasize, what they ignore, and what they let slide. People managers, on the other hand, they're reinforcing it daily. They are the culture carriers. They are making small decisions every single day, how they give feedback, how they hold boundaries, how they handle conflict. They're the ones who are either amplifying your culture or eroding it quietly, sometimes through simply inaction. And then veterans and your high performers, they are setting the tone. Through example, people are watching them. So new hires, they're not going to learn how to show up from the employee handbook. They learn by watching the people who've already been rewarded. So if your most celebrated people are collaborative, respectful, generous with knowledge, others will follow suit. But if they're aggressive or defensive, or they're the type of people that hoard information and they still get promoted, that becomes the blueprint. And then you have systems and processes defining what matters, because culture is also structural. This means like how you run performance reviews, who gets recognized, what feedback is acted on. These shape the real values of the company. So if someone says teamwork matters, but your bonus system only rewards individual output, you can guess which message is going to stick. Culture is not set in the company values poster. It's set in this kind of gray space. It's set when a high performer acts out and leadership has to decide if they are going to protect that output or uphold the values. It is set when and how feedback is handled, whether it's welcomed or whether it's punished, whether that's politically, publicly. It's set when priorities shift. Are you still going to be strategic, or are you just going to react to noise? And it's set by who gets promoted and why. Are you looking for results, or are you looking for a combination of results and behavior? Culture is ultimately shaped by what gets normalized and what people come to expect, what they assume is going to happen, and what doesn't surprise them anymore. And the most powerful culture shapers are the people at the top, because everyone else is watching them. And then the next question becomes, are you leading your culture on purpose, or are you just letting it happen? This is one of my favorite lines. If you don't define your culture, it will be defined for you by accident, by inertia, or by the loudest voices in the room. And isn't that true? I feel like we've probably all experienced this at some point or another. So let's talk about what culture looks like in practice. This is kind of where I feel the most passionate, because these are the small, often invisible decisions determining whether people inside your organization feel empowered or whether they feel controlled. Hopefully these come up one at a time. Okay, good. Number one, decision-making norms. So who gets a say inside your organization, formally and informally? What types of decisions are escalated? Which ones are deferred? Which ones are ignored? So for example, if a company says it values autonomy, but every decision still goes through 2 layers of approval, your culture is saying otherwise. Power dynamics and voice. This is about who speaks up in meetings and who stays quiet. Are you welcoming dissent and challenges? Are you punishing it socially or politically? How are you resolving conflict? Is it directly addressed? Is it passive? Does it happen behind closed doors? This is the silent force behind innovation, speed, and trust. Accountability loops. So are mistakes surfaced early or are they buried until too late? Are your teams actually learning from failure? Do they have those processes in place or are they just moving on? Because accountability without blame is a critical mechanic and it's often missing. And then feedback flow. So whether this is up, oops, you click, up, down, or across. Is feedback encouraged across all levels or is it being sanitized? Are there safe, trusted mechanisms for raising real concerns? Because most companies will have like feedback mechanisms on paper, but your culture will determine whether anyone uses them in any kind of honest way. And then prioritization and practice. When everything is urgent, as it often is, what is actually getting done? And who gets to decide what is getting dropped? Culture will shape what people focus on, even when leaders don't realize it. And then this one is pretty well documented. Recognition and reward. What gets celebrated? Is praise tied to aligned behaviors, or is it just hitting your numbers? Who is getting promoted, and what does that say about what is valued inside the company? Whatever gets rewarded becomes that behavioral blueprint for everyone else. So now that we've clearly defined, hopefully, the concept and the mechanics of culture, let's shift gears and talk about capability. Capability is your organization's ability to execute with consistency. So it's the systems, it's the rhythms, it's the coordination that turns ideas into action consistently, even when they're under pressure. So while culture shapes how people behave and interact, capability is what will allow the work to move forward at the speed and quality that your strategy demands. Not surprisingly, McKinsey found that organizations that build capability intentionally through systems, through training, decisions, frameworks, and cross-functional integration outperform their peers by 24% in profitability. And that's because capability creates the ability to scale. If culture is your organizational health, capability is your organizational strength. It's what allows you to execute, and it's what allows you to recover when things go sideways, which inevitably they sometimes will. I've seen teams with brilliant strategy fall flat because no one knew who was supposed to do what. No one knew how information moved or what done actually meant. And on the other side of the coin, I've seen teams with only moderate strategy win because they had capability, which means they had clear handoffs in place, they made fast decisions, they had systems that were aligned, they took the time for consistent check-ins, and they shared a collective understanding of what good looks like. When capability works, it's something that you can feel because there's momentum. Decisions don't die in meetings, and people aren't reinventing the wheel or each other's work. There are 5 clear markers of strong organizational capability, and really, they're not flashy, they are not complicated, but when they're missing, things will fall apart fast. And so the first is decision making. How quickly and confidently can decisions be made inside your organization? This means knowing who owns what criteria guides decisions, and how fast teams can respond without bottlenecks or endless loops. The next is onboarding. So a capable organization doesn't reinvent the wheel every time someone joins. Onboarding is intentional, it's not ad hoc. It's meant to transfer knowledge, building context, and setting clear expectations from day one. And it has the ability to transfer knowledge. This is when teams don't hoard knowledge or reinvent past work. So they have systems in place to capture learnings, they share best practices, and they make sure information flows across both roles and functions. And role clarity. So when capability is weak, when role clarity is not there, people hesitate and then work ends up being duplicated. When role clarity is strong, it's clear, handoffs are clean, and decisions don't die in the middle. And then finally, strong capability lets you scale without burning out your team. So it means having the tools, the systems, the staffing flexibility to support growth without chaos. When these 5 things work together, teams can move fast and stay aligned. So that's what makes capability an asset, not just a structure. And the difference between culture and capability, one is what shapes how people feel, the other shapes what people can do. Both are essential if you want your strategy to stick. So we'll just take a quick close look at how they differ and how they work together. Capability is driven by strategy, clear goals, resource plans, execution paths. Culture, though, is more psychological. It's about how safe people feel to ask questions, how safe they feel to raise concerns or take initiative. Culture operates through informal norms. What's okay to challenge? What actually gets rewarded? And what behaviors are tolerated? Capability, on the other hand, shows up in formal structure. So who owns what, how handoffs happen, and how decisions get made. Capability will focus more on what gets done, KPIs, milestones, deliverables, while culture will focus on how people show up, the energy they bring, the ownership they feel, and the resilience that they can tap into when things go wrong. Culture feels like energy, and capability feels like momentum. It's kind of my favorite way to sum it all up. And then I couldn't resist putting this in here because capability isn't just an org chart or a playbook. It's also in how someone kicks off a project, hands off a task, or walks a teammate through something they're asking for. Because at the organizational level, I think of capability as scaffolding, but at the task level, it's about clarity, communication, and consistency. And that's tough because there are a million tasks that pop up a day. And so it's hard to treat each one with the same level of respect. But this idea has really helped me when I'm handing off anything to delegate. Because one of the most capability killing dynamics I see inside organizations is this. Leaders get frustrated that teams aren't executing at the level they expect, but they have not taken the time to actually walk them through the full picture. So this model, which is adapted from Brené Brown's work, gives us this idea of a staircase, 5 layers of context that should accompany any meaningful task. As leaders, we need to walk our teams up and down the staircase from vision to execution and back again. So that means when you're asking someone to do something, we need to give them color. So what does done look like? Not just the deliverable, but also what are your standards? And then context. What else is going on? What are the competing priorities? Who are the key stakeholders? What is the timing? Connective tissue. This is one of my favorites because it's such an important part of change management as well. Why does this matter? How does it fit into the bigger picture? And then costs. What are the trade-offs? What's the ask of your time, your energy, your resources? And consequences, what happens if we get this wrong or right? And I don't think of this as micromanagement, it's kind of the opposite. It's not just communication, it's capability building because you're giving these boundaries. You're not telling people how to get something done, but you're giving them all the information they need to understand what needs to happen and what your expectations are. Things like this, to me, they really make clarity a system and one that has very clear boundaries. And then execution becomes the shared language. And without it, even the most competent teams can struggle to deliver. But we're also building something else at the same time, which is trust, which is a felt sense of clarity, safety, respect, which brings us here to the intersection of culture and capability. This slide seems so simple on the surface, but it sums up everything we've been talking about. Culture is how it feels to work here. Culture is the daily micro signals about what matters and how we treat each other. Capability is how it works here. The structure, the systems, the way things actually move or don't inside your business. One is emotional, the other is operational, but both are essential. Because if it feels good to work here, but nothing gets done, that's super frustrating. And if things get done, but people feel ignored or burned out, that's not sustainable. And you don't have to pick one. In fact, all the most resilient companies know that when culture and capability work together, strategy not only moves faster, but the people inside your business will stick around to actually make it happen. And then when culture and capability are in sync, they feed off each other in the best way. A strong culture drives aligned behaviors. Those behaviors strengthen your system and execution. And when capability strengthens, it reinforces culture because now people can see it working. They trust in it, they invest in it. And this is how you scale without losing alignment. I think of this as the difference between rowing and sailing. You can brute force your way through growth for a while, but when culture and capability lock in together, that is like the wind beneath your wings, the wind beneath your sails. But of course, there's a flip side. When culture and capability don't reinforce each other, they clash. This is when you can start hearing things like, we say we value innovation, but no one wants to take a risk. Or we say we want speed, but everything still needs 6 approvals. And that's when you start losing traction and trust. Because when they are out of sync, it creates a drag that you can feel. So the flywheel either becomes your greatest accelerant or your most exhausting cycle to push against. And the difference comes down to intentional alignment between what you say, how you act, and how your systems operate. So the question becomes, if the flywheel is either spinning or stalling, what actually gets it moving? How do we stop culture and capability from being one and done initiatives and turn them into something that's lived and reinforced every day? And the answer, as annoying as it is, and as often as it comes up, is not in grand gestures. It's in these small, consistent signals that leaders send through what they say, what they do, and what they prioritize. And so what does that look like in practice? The good news is you don't need a massive culture initiative or a new task force, although I'd love to help you with those. The biggest impact often comes from small, intentional shifts in how you lead day to day. So here are 4 habits that I encourage leaders to build. Keep in mind every day. Make it clear. So this is about aligning your team on what matters and, more importantly, what does not matter. You have to be explicit about priorities, trade-offs, and expectations, because a lot of a misalignment will end up coming not from confusion, but from assuming everyone's on the same page when they are not. The next is to make it easy. So reduce friction in the system. If your team is spending hours figuring out next steps, chasing approvals, or duplicating work, they are not spending their time building capability. They're just burning energy. So streamline wherever you can. Make it visible. So you really need to celebrate aligned behaviors in real time. This means calling out when values show up in action, not just when your KPIs or your results are hit. Because culture will stick when people see it in motion, not just in writing. And then make it consistent. The tone you set when things are hard, especially when they're hard, is when it matters the most. Because consistency builds trust. It's how people know you mean what you say, even when priorities shift or pressure rises. But wait, there's more. These are 5 other questions and behaviors that may seem small, but over time, they will shape what your team believes is possible. So if you're in a leadership role, you don't just run the strategy, you also need to understand that you're setting the temperature. And that means, again, every meeting, every decision, every reaction is a cultural signal. So make those signals intentional. When you're in a meeting, ask, who else should be in this conversation? This is such a simple question that will build inclusion into your process. It helps you avoid the trap of echo chambers and brings in voices that often get missed, especially, I cannot say this enough, the frontline expertise who is interacting with your customers every day and running your day-to-day operations. Acknowledge trade-offs when naming priorities. So you can't pretend that everything is top priority. And when you name what's getting dropped, so like I said in the last slide, exactly what doesn't need to get done, you build trust and you make people believe that it's possible for the real priorities to come to fruition. And model healthy disagreement in meetings. I feel like this comes up in every presentation I do, but you set the tone for how teams can respectfully challenge each other. So you have to show that dissent isn't dangerous. It's a really, really healthy part of making better decisions. And then reward effort aligned with values, not just outcomes. If someone takes a risk in service of the right behavior, even if it fails, it should be acknowledged. This is how you create a culture of learning and integrity, not a culture of fear and perfectionism, which will stall innovation so fast. And then share one behind the scenes decision rationale each week. This is meant to show people your thinking. So even a 60-second explanation will build transparency and will show your employees, your team members, your leadership team that the decisions that you're making are not arbitrary. They are values driven. And so these are the moves that make culture visible, credible, and real. But culture does not just flow top down. It also gets shaped peer to peer, moment by moment, through what people say, celebrate, and call out. So if you're not in a formal leadership role, these 5 actions can still make you a culture shaper. And the first is be what you want to see in the world. Model what you want to multiply. Show up how you want others to show up, especially under pressure, because behavior spreads faster than a cold and it spreads faster than policy. The second is ask better questions, especially the ones that are meant to surface up blind spots. Sometimes the most valuable thing you bring to the table, especially if you have been outside the room for a while, is curiosity. So don't be afraid to ask why something matters, how it connects, to think about what could go wrong, because those types of questions sharpen everyone's thinking. Also connect actions to value, so explain why it matters. So when you send that email or launch a project, take a second to say, we're doing this because it supports X value or priority. That's how alignment gets reinforced by individual contributors every day. Amplify aligned wins. So small praise goes really far when someone lives the culture, not just when they hit the metric. Slack shout outs or celebrations are not limited to just leaders. Contributors can also say, hey, I noticed that. That was awesome. And those small moments reinforce identity. And then speak up with care, not fear. So be constructive, not silent. You don't need to have all the answers to raise a concern or to offer an idea. Just speak with attention, assume positive intent in others, because that is how your dialogue will stay healthy and will stay brave. So you don't need a title to shape culture. You just need to act on what you believe, act out loud and consistently. Easier said than done, I know. But when people do this enough, the culture will shift. And then before I wrap up, I just want to zoom back out because these are the 4 pillars of growth readiness. These are what I've seen again and again in companies that scale, not just quickly, but sustainably. So strategic clarity and decision velocity, this is about clear priorities and fast decisions. Productive tension, that's about safety to challenge, alignment to decide, and respect to move forward. Customer-informed innovations, listening with discipline and leading with confidence. And operational adaptability is about flexible systems, continuous learning, and scalable execution. But of course, every one of these pillars rests on something deeper. You can have a sharp strategy, a bold plan, the best CEO, a great team on paper. But if your culture is confusing or your capability is inconsistent, it's all going to feel harder than it has to. Culture and capability are the foundation. They are what allows your decisions to stick, your feedback to flow, and your systems to flex when the market shifts. If you don't reinforce them, the pillars can't hold. And if you've attended my other sessions, you know I love giving an assessment or a prompt to map where you are and what's next. And I was thinking about this today, and I was like, I'll just throw this in here because I really want everyone to think about how you can leverage AI to help you in your day-to-day job. I didn't really make an assessment because culture doesn't necessarily follow a checklist. It's so deeply personal to what you're trying to create and how you want to work. So here's what I will offer instead. If you don't know what kind of culture you're trying to build, pause and imagine it. How do people feel when they walk into a meeting? How do they work through conflict? What is the energy like when someone makes a mistake or speaks up? Once you have that picture, write it out long form, write it out however you want, and drop it into ChatGPT and ask, what values am I describing? Or what questions should I be asking to define this culture? If you've already got stated values or a mission statement, you can create your own GPT and book a meeting with me, a free meeting. I would be happy to show you how. It's really easy, but you can use it like your culture mirror. You can run internal comms through it, your onboarding docs, your strategy deck, your handbook. All you do is really put in your stated values and your mission. And you can ask, does this reflect the culture we're trying to build? Or does it tell a different story? AI is not going to replace intentional leadership, but it can offer a surprisingly helpful outside perspective. And it's really hard when you're inside the system to get that. So sometimes what you need isn't really a new framework. It's just a fresh lens and the time to play around with ChatGPT, which is definitely worth it. Okay, so today we focus on culture and capability. Those are the forces that determine whether your strategy lives or dies in the day-to-day. But we're not stopping there, because up next, I'm going to dig into how strategy moves through an organization, not just how it gets written, but how it gets lived. And then after that, we'll explore the voice of employee and customer. So how to listen well, how to make sense of feedback, how to avoid decision-making that's either too insular or too reactive. And then we'll close this with a series. We'll close the series with a conversation I'm especially excited for, which is scaling without losing yourself. So how to grow without burning out your people, diluting your values, or losing the very things that made your company great in the first place. And it's the first Wednesday, except for in July. I'm skipping that 4th of July week. First Wednesday of the month, within 45 minutes flat, we'll cover all of these topics. And each session builds on the last. So if today sparked something for you, come back, bring a friend. Love to see them. And if you're wondering to yourself, what types of projects does Lee take on? This is a quick snapshot of some things that I tend to take on, which is customer intelligence. We talked a lot today about leadership and organizational alignment, and one of my favorite topics, which is change leadership and strategic transformation. And finally, I did that under 40. Thank you for showing up. Thanks for being part of today's workshop. Keep an eye on your inbox, because I will be sending a follow-up with a link to today's presentation and registration links for future sessions. And just so you know, I really am on the other end of those emails. So if something resonated with you today, hit reply, tell me what stuck with you, tell me where it landed. I would genuinely love to hear from you. And I hope you feel like today's time was well spent. And I hope to see you on June 4th for the next session. Thank you so much for joining me.